Welcome to SLP Nerdcast. I'm Kate.
And I'm Amy, and we appreciate you tuning in, whether you're an SLP, a teacher, an EI provider, an allied health professional, or a parent or guardian of somebody with speech and language needs. We hope this podcast will give you some valuable information and keep you at least a little entertained. In our podcast, we review resources, literature, and discuss issues that are related to the field of speech-language pathology.
You can use this podcast for ASHA professional development. For more information about us and certification maintenance hours, go to our website, www.slpnerdcast.com. If you don't need a certificate or CMH hours, but would still like a handout about today's episode, you can find that on the episode page as well. There will also be links to any resources or literature that we cite during this episode. There we go. That was fine. We had a new intro for all of our regular listeners. I think we are going to do something a little different today. Before we talk about our learning objectives and the topic, we are going to quickly review our financial and non-financial disclosures. So our financial disclosures are that me, Kate, I am the owner of Grand Bois Therapy and Consulting and co-founder of SLP Nerdcast. Amy is an employee of a public school system and the other co-founder of SLP Nerdcast. Non-financial, we are both members of ASHA SIG 12, and we both serve on the AAC advisory group for Massachusetts Advocates for Children. I am also a member of the Berkshire Association for Behavior Analysts and Therapy, otherwise known as BABIT. I'm also a member of Mass ABA, the Association for Behavior Analysis International, otherwise known as ABAI, and the corresponding Speech Pathology and Applied Behavior Analysis Special Interest Group. That was a whole lot. Those are all of our financial and non-financial disclosures. So now that the housekeeping things are out of the way, what are we talking about today?
Today, we are talking about measurable goals and objectives, which is
surprisingly, I didn't know that there was so much to know about this. I was a little on the naive side. When we started planning for this episode, I was saying things like, well, what do you mean we do an episode about this? You just write an objective that's measurable. And then we started talking about it, and I learned that I didn't know very much about this, and there's lots of good information to know. So this was a learning process. Yes, we're excited to share it. Yeah. Our learning objectives for today, there's 3 of them. The first is identify components of quality measurement and different types of data collection that are relevant to goal writing. We're going to spend about 10 minutes going through some of that. Second objective, identify necessary considerations prior to beginning to write goals. We're going to spend about 20 minutes on that. And then the final learning objective, label and provide an example for each component of a SMART goal. We're going to spend about a half hour, the bulk of the episode, talking about that last objective. Right?
All right, buddy. Yeah. Well said.
Ready to go?
Well done. Yes.
So learning objective number 1, identify components of quality measurement and different types of data collection that are relevant to goal writing. For those of you who are regular listeners, the first pieces of this objective are going to be a slight review from some of the topics and resources that were covered in our data collection episode. So as we were preparing for this and discussing it, we realized that in order to really think about the required components of objective writing, you really need to have a good foundational understanding of measurement and data collection. So first things first, what is good data and what is bad data, right? Not all data is created equal, and not all measurement is created equal.
And without good data, your goals and objectives, it doesn't matter how wonderfully they're crafted, the good data is what's informing your choices.
Right, exactly. And I think it's important also to think about the concepts of data and measurement. So when we say measurement, we're talking about how you're going about collecting the data. Whereas some people may hear the word data and just think, oh, that's the numbers those are the tally marks that I scratch on the piece of paper. Mm-hmm. So there are good components. There's good quality data and there's bad quality data. Back in our data collection episode, we had reviewed an article by Olswang and Bain, and it's a really great article. We're going to have it up on our episode page. We're not going to go through that in too much detail, but overall, good data has 3 components, and you can refer to that article for more information if you want to get into this. But good data has 3 components. Data needs to be accurate, data needs to be valid, and data needs to be reliable. So let's go through that first piece of accuracy, accurate data. Data that is accurate means that the observer values match the true values. That's it's a little vague. So let's use an example to really unpack it a little. Take a scale. A scale is a way of measuring things, right? So if you have a scale, if you put potatoes on the scale, this is the funny, we always laugh, why potatoes? You could put something else on the scale for that. We could make it weird.
Yeah,
Cactuses.
make
Let's
it
put
potatoes.
cactuses on the
Cactus.
if you want to stick with potatoes. Okay.
I
We
like
can
the
stick with
potatoes.
potatoes. Okay, so if you put potatoes on the scale and the scale says that the potatoes weigh 1.5 pounds, that measurement is accurate if the potatoes actually weigh 1.5 pounds. The value measured by the scale is the true value. So that is an example of how data is accurate when the value matches the observer value matches the true value. Let's talk about validity. That's one of the other components. Data should always be valid. Validity is how well something measures what it is supposed to measure. So same scenario, same example. You put the potatoes on the scale because you want to know how much the potatoes weigh. But this is a super weird scale. And instead of telling you how much the potato weighs, the scale tells you the potato's density. That is not a valid measurement of weight.
And I think this is one of the components of good data that we sometimes have trouble with when we're writing goals and objectives. Like sometimes, and we'll talk more about this later, sometimes we defer to putting in things like percent accuracy when really that's not actually measuring what we really want to measure. So this is a really important component. I think, I mean, obviously accuracy is very important too. We want to measure what we really want to measure, but the validity is something to really step back and think about when you're writing your goals.
I think that absolutely. Last one, data should be reliable. Reliable data is when the same values are determined over repeated measurements. So using the same analogy, you put the potatoes on the scale says 1.5 pounds. You come back tomorrow and the scale still says 1.5 pounds. If it says all of a sudden that the same bag of potatoes weighs 2 pounds, your scale is not a reliable measurement. So thinking about these components of quality data, you really want to make sure that when you're thinking about goal and objective writing, you're doing what you can to keep reliability, validity, and accuracy at a high threshold. So when you're choosing a data collection system, you want to choose one that yields good data. You also want to make sure that you're choosing a data collection system that is realistic within your setting and something that you feel you have the resources to actually apply to get that measurement. There's another really great article that we're not going to go into in too much detail by Jane Corsten called Meaningful Data, Making Sense of the Plus and Minus. If you are interested in reading more about this, we highly recommend this article. It's a really, really great article. We're going to refer to it, I think, a couple more times throughout the course of this episode. This article helps you summarize things that you need to consider when designing your data collection system. And one of the biggest components of designing your data collection system is considering what are you trying to measure? What is the communicative behavior that you are really trying to capture as a point of, we're not taking data for fun. Nobody takes data for fun. You're taking it to measure something really, well, Amy does. You're taking it something really specific and, you're measuring something really specific for the point, for the long-term goal of upholding that goal that you have written. What are the minimum performance criteria that you need to consider? What are the obstacles that you need to consider in terms of the success of that goal? what specific components of the behavior or the communication acts do you need to consider?
And I think that a lot of these points and questions that Corsten raises in this article are things that we will see echoed in the articles that we'll reference later with respect to SMART goals. Part of what a SMART goal incorporates is answering all of these different questions and making sure that there's enough information there so that you truly are painting the picture of what you're measuring, how you're measuring it, and what is the criteria by which you'll know, okay, this goal has been achieved.
Right.
Um,
Right, totally. So, I mean, and just sort of thinking about those foundational components that you're using to uphold the validity of that goal or what it is you're really trying to achieve. There are a lot of different kinds of measurement types that you could consider, and you really want to make sure that you're choosing one that is going to accurately capture the communication behavior that you're looking at. So there's quantitative measurement types and there are qualitative measurement types. Again, the Olswang and Bang, Olswang and Bang, Olswang and Bain. I always
yeah,
butcher
you
the
do.
last. That's the theme here. That's the theme. Um, and they give a really, really great, more in-depth description in their article. We're going to go through a few of them and explain and really focus on the quantitative components of data collection because those tend to be the most closely tied to what you would see in a written objective or measurement for an objective or goal. So one of the ones that we see a lot is frequency. So this method refers to the number of times that a target behavior was observed or counted. So you might say, Johnny said a target word 8 times. This goes into a percentage, which is another form that we see a lot. So 8 times out of 10 times. Rate is another one. Rate is very similar to frequency, but it's a number of instances of a target word or a target behavior within a specific period of time. So for example, Johnny said a target word 8 times in 15 minutes. Duration is another one that is really, really appropriate for certain communicative behaviors, but one that we don't see very often written in, or at least I don't see very often written in goals and objectives. Duration measures the amount of time that someone engages in a behavior or a communication act. An example would be Johnny jointly attended to a task for a peer for 45 seconds. We're going to talk about this a little bit more, but you wouldn't necessarily say with 80% accuracy. The duration might be a much more appropriate way to capture a joint attention skill. And the final one we're going to go over is latency. Latency refers to the amount of time that passes between when you expect someone to engage in a task and when the response actually begins. So this could be related to initiating communication, responding to verbally delivered questions, executing a task after a verbal direction had been given, etc. So for example, Johnny begins putting his lunchbox away 25 seconds after his teacher gave him the direction. Johnny, put away your lunchbox. And in that example, latency is a great way to measure that task, assuming that you are really interested in latency, as opposed to just writing, Johnny will follow a direction with 80% accuracy. So you can see there's in really understanding the different types of measurement, they lend themselves to different kinds of communicative behaviors, depending on what it is you're trying to measure.
I agree. And I think when we consider writing goals and objectives, you really do want to be a bit flexible with the different types of ways that you might collect that data in thinking not only about what's going to give you the most valid data and measure what you actually want to measure, but also thinking about what's feasible in that environment. So that sort of brings us to our second learning objective, identifying the necessary considerations before you even start to write your goals. The way that you write your goals, the focus of your goals, that will vary quite a bit depending upon your employment setting. But there are some things that are universal. When we look at ASHA's Code of Ethics, that makes it clear that we should all be using, some metrics to guide our practice. So in looking through the Code of Ethics, some of the components that are really relevant to writing goals and objectives would be Principle 1K. Individuals who hold the certificate of clinical competence shall evaluate the effectiveness of services provided, technology employed, and products dispensed, and they shall provide services or dispense products only when benefit can be reasonably expected. So I don't know how you can evaluate effectiveness if you haven't defined your goals and objectives.
I gotta say, when you read the Code of Ethics, it's applying it to goals and objectives is not something that it doesn't jump out at you right away, but you're so right. I mean, if we're ethically bound to evaluate the effectiveness of our services, how could you possibly do that with a bad objective? Not a bad objective, but an objective or goal that doesn't accurately measure or target what it is that you're interested in seeing.
Right. I mean, if you don't know what it is exactly that you're trying to achieve, how will you determine whether you've achieved it or not?
Right. Exactly.
When we look at Principle 1M, that covers individuals who hold the certificate of clinical competence shall use independent and evidence-based clinical judgment, keeping paramount the best interests of those being served. So evidence-based practice is going to involve integrating your own clinical experience and evidence with the existing research. Again, you don't have clinical evidence if you're not collecting data to address your goals and objectives, right? So that's an important part of making sure that we're using evidence-based clinical judgment. And then I also think keeping paramount the best interest of those being served. We're a fun bunch, us speech language pathologists, right? People hopefully enjoy spending time with us. But ultimately, if people are coming to us for a service, they're coming so that they can achieve a certain goal, right? I hurt my knee. My PT was lovely. They were both lovely. But I was not I would rather have gone home after work than have gone to PT and paid $20, right? So I'm going to achieve an outcome. That outcome was to be able to do things without my knee hurting. And it's the same with people who are coming to see us for speech and language services. We really want to be using approaches that are very effective for our clients, maximize their outcome. And our goals and objectives should really be the scope and sequence for our services. It should help us make sure that we're having clear conversations with our clients about what we're all working on together. It should help us have an ongoing conversation and sort of an anchor to come back to in terms of evaluating their progress toward those goals, and making sure that we're doing it in the most effective way possible. We don't want to take any more time or money than we should be to help achieve those goals and objectives. So that brings us kind of the final area where I felt like it was really relevant to our code of ethics, which is Principle 1Q. Individuals shall maintain timely records, accurately record and bill for services provided and products dispensed, and shall not misrepresent services provided, products dispensed, or research and scholarly activities conducted.
This is really interesting because when you read this component of the ethical code, again, writing objectives is not what jumps out at you, but it's absolutely true. I mean, when you read this, you think, oh, I have to write notes and I have to not bill for services I didn't perform and, the obvious things, but writing your goals and objectives are part of an accurate record keeping.
Right. And your notes should connect with your goals and objectives. So all of these pieces,
totally.
This is universal for everybody. It doesn't matter what your work environment is. This applies to you, right? So in doing some research for this podcast, we found two particularly excellent articles in addition to the two that Kate already talked to you guys about. But these articles were about writing measurable goals. And the first is by Nancy Swigert. Now it's my turn to hurt people's last names.
No, you did that beautifully. You never butcher them like I do.
I don't know.
I become like
Nancy. I hope we got it right.
Sorry, Nancy.
But her article was published in 2014 in an issue of Perspectives on Swallowing and Swallowing Disorders. And then the second article is by Emily Diehm.
Yeah, I'm going to go with Diehm.
Diehm.
Yeah.
Emily, let us know.
Yeah,
and that article is titled Writing Measurable and Academically Relevant IEP Goals with 80% accuracy over 3 consecutive trials. And this is from SIG 16 perspective. So a cool thing, Kate mentioned in our disclosures that we're both members of SIG 12. If you are a member of any SIG, you should be able to access all of the SIG journals, which is pretty awesome. And both of these articles are from sort of different clinical environments, but both relevant and really helpful. So they're both covering goals, goal writing. They outline the importance of other components that are necessary when you're writing measurable and meaningful goals. And we're going to start there with these things that you need to think about before you're even getting started with the goal writing process. So the Swigert article. This article is talking about the medical model circa 2014. And there's a quote here that practitioners must be aware of the focus on value from Medicare's value-based purchasing to the consumer's idea of value. And value is defined as outcomes divided by the total cost. So I haven't been in healthcare for a while as a provider, but as a consumer of healthcare, like that idea resonates with me, right? Like I would like really good outcomes at the lowest possible cost. So back to, my PT example, I'm going to like just keep recycling this, but if I can get function and pain reduction in my knee and spend $120 and go for, 8 sessions, I'm going to prefer that to spending twice as much and going twice as often, right? So this concept of value added, while it's coming from Medicare, it's coming from, third-party payers, I think it's probably also relevant across all settings, right? We want that same thing.
I think as professionals as a whole, we don't want to see our services as being poorly valued or, people aren't getting anything out of it or, for a whole host of reasons.
Well, and when you connect it back to the code of ethics, again, like
Right.
principles 1K, principles 1M, like we should be providing services only when there's reasonable expectation of benefit, and we should be holding our clients' best interest paramount. And I don't think there are many people, if any people, who are like, no, sign me up for the expensive, less effective one.
Right, exactly. Like, I'm going to increase my rate by 10%, but then give you half the service.
Right.
That's just, no.
That's frowned upon.
It's just silliness.
Right. Don't do that. So connected with this in that same Swigert article is the idea of patient-reported outcomes, or PROs. So meaning that the funding sources, which she was saying in the article, is that the funding sources aren't really just concerned with whether or not the patient met their goals, but also like how happy were they about it? What did the patient think about it? She gives some examples about different PRO tools that could be of interest if you're a listener who works in dysphagia in a medical setting. And these are kind of like, for me, when I was reading it, it felt kind of like the consumer satisfaction surveys that you get sometimes when you like call your credit card company or something. And they're like, how did this guy do in helping you out? So the concept is relevant to writing goals and objectives, because the patient or the client, the student, their family, whoever you're writing your goals to support, they should be a central part of the goal selection and planning process. So I'm going to quote her because I thought that this was awesome and really relevant across settings. And so what she says in the article is that clinicians often discuss the treatment goals with the patient and the caregivers, but may not always get a commitment from the patient and caregivers on what they're willing to work towards. Too often, the SLP is setting goals they expect the patient to achieve in therapy sessions with them. With the changing healthcare environment, SLPs should develop treatment plans with a focus on the patient working on the goals outside of the therapy session as much as possible. Placing more responsibility on the patient for achieving goals is also called patient self-management, a practice not ingrained in the field of speech-language pathology.
That is such a great point. And I think that depending on where you work, depending on your work setting, this may or may not be salient. It may or may not be highlighted. So for example, in my years previously working in a hospital outpatient setting, if you didn't send home homework, if you didn't send home, home related, tasks, and they didn't bring it back to you and prove that they were working on things at home, you got discharged. That was just cold turkey.
Yep.
Fast forward many years later to working, having exposure to school systems. That is not really something, at least in my experience, that was really a focus of the school SLP's job, because the funding source didn't require it. The administration didn't necessarily require it. And I think the key piece there is not so much whether or not your administration requires it, but if you have buy-in, if you have genuine interest, if you have written a goal or objective that is perceived as having value by the family, by the parents, by the stakeholder, by the student, by the individual themselves, you have such a higher likelihood that they will work on it outside of your treatment room, that they will work on it at home. They will take those opportunities when they're on the playground or, wherever they are in their community, which means they are going to make better gains. They're going to have, they're going to achieve more skills. And I think rooting that in writing a good objective is the most genius mind explosion thing that I've ever heard.
Yeah, it was awesome. It was awesome. I was like, this is so good. But I think, it raises such a great point, which is that you need to be aware of the requirements and also the culture of your setting. So when we think about, outpatient or inpatient models, there are different kind of primary overarching goals of the organization with respect to your therapy. And the funding agencies also have different expectations with respect to your therapy. So, and I think it's true for the idea that having outside involvement is important for anybody to make progress on their speech and language goals, I think is true and relevant regardless of your setting. But if you're in a school-based setting and not a medical environment, it may be different because your mandate is different also. When you're in a school environment, what you really are working on is providing access to the academic curriculum, right? So if you're in a school-based setting, the more familiar you are with the curriculum standards, the Common Core, your state-specific standards, like this is really your job. Your job is less perhaps about communicating something specific in the home environment. Not that homework isn't relevant, but in school, the homework in part becomes utilizing that skill across academics. So your primary support is the family, but also even more so the other school providers, making sure that you're unpacking the speech and language skills required for accessing grade level academic standards. When we look on ASHA's website, there's a great handout that we will have up on our website, but they look at the drivers for school-based speech and language services, and they're different. They are connected to educational relevance. And they say the litmus test for roles assumed by SLPs in school settings is whether or not their work has an impact on the education of students. Therefore, SLPs address personal, social, academic, and vocational needs that have an impact on attainment of educational goals. And in order for a problem to rise to the level of a disability addressed under federal law, the problem has to have an adverse educational effect. So therefore, educational relevance needs to be a factor in provision of speech and language services in a school.
And I think we all know how important it is to generalize, right? We all know that we're supposed to be looping in the classroom teacher. Just think about the school setting, but sort of looping this back to when you're writing your goals and objectives, what does the teacher think is valuable? What are the other individuals on the team, the other clinicians, the other stakeholders within the school? What do they see as valuable in terms of getting access to that curriculum? And those are conversations that I'm not sure, I guess it depends on where you are, but they're really important questions to ask, and they might not always be obvious.
And if you are a school-based provider, the first thing you need to figure out is, are you a state or a school system where you follow the Common Core curriculum? Think about where your student is for their age level, for their grade level. Are they able to access grade level standards? And don't limit yourself only to things that seem speech and languagey. So ELA, English Language Arts, seems like something that's a natural best friend for speech and language, right? We can see a lot of need for support there when we look at the curriculum. But there could also be a need that your student has. If you have a student who has a language-based learning disability, they may struggle with word problems in math. So look at all of the different components of the curriculum for their grade level If they aren't able to access the grade level content with supports, then look back to earlier entry point skills. And the more you do this, the better you'll get at being able to hold these curriculum expectations in your head and consider them when you're assessing students. Definitely check out page 37 of Deem's article, where she gives really good tips for unpacking the related speech and language skills that are required for accessing grade level academic standards. It's a very helpful way to help detangle all of the little pieces that go into something like being able to identify the main idea. So with that said, when you've considered, what are the priorities for your particular work environment, are they tied to patient outcomes? Are they tied to, the need to connect with academics? Something else that every person should be doing before they're writing goals and objectives is doing some form of assessment, right? Assessments should be driving all of your goal setting. Doesn't have to mean formal assessments. For people who are in the schools, you're probably only conducting a standardized eligibility assessment every 3 years or so. But it does mean you need to analyze your client's current performance and their repertoire of skills. And you can't be generating effective goals and objectives, even if you know your environment and the expectations for your environment very well. Without some form of assessment, you don't understand where your client's needs fit in relationship to those priorities.
So thinking about that as part of the school setting, if you're only doing your official 3-year evaluation every 3 years, but every IEP, every time you go to rewrite your objectives, you're doing some form of informal analysis and assessment based on their current level of performance, and then projecting, and you're, responsible for writing objectives that are achievable, reasonable within the environment, et cetera, et cetera. You have to go through that analytic assessment process at least once a year in the school setting. And in an outpatient setting, every time your insurance is up, I
Right.
think most places, and we would do it in the hospital every 6 weeks, sometimes every 10 weeks. If you've got 4 visits and you had to submit a
Yep.
reevaluation based on current status, sometimes that was every 4 weeks. The reassessment, reevaluation process is much more frequent, and depending on your funding source, if you're in a hospital setting, or an outpatient setting, or even a private practice setting, really. But I guess I'm just highlighting that no matter where you are, you are always revisiting your goals and objectives with some form of analysis and assessment.
Yes. And when you're doing something that does incorporate a standardized assessment, raw scores, error analyses, they help you form clinical impressions that drive your choices around your goals and objectives. But you don't want to write a goal to target a specific test item or a series of test items. That's poor practice. School-based SLPs should be working with other people on the team and using a variety of informal assessment measures. And that's true also for, regardless of your setting, use informal assessment measures as well, to supplement the information that you're obtaining through a norm referenced assessment. So you want to just make sure that you're getting a lot of different information about the individual and then using that. So, okay, you've assessed your client, you've incorporated your input from other stakeholders, you've thought about the particular outcome drivers unique to your work environment, which might be something like moving a patient to a less supportive level of care and greater level of independence, or, it could be educational relevance and attainment of educational goals. Like, you've given those thoughts, you've conducted your assessment, you're ready now to write some goals. So exciting.
Kickoff. Is that a kickoff to objective number 3?
Sure is, buddy. Sure is.
So objective number 3, label and provide an example for each component of a SMART goal. I have a confession.
Yeah. What is
I've been
that?
a practicing speech pathologist for a long time. I'm pretty good at my job, I think. I haven't been in trouble or had too many people mad at me. I didn't know what a SMART goal was. I've never heard that term. Amy,
It's
what
so
is
it's
a
so funny.
SMART goal?
A SMART goal. So SMART is, of course, it's an acronym because we love acronyms in our field. The SMART goal approach is something that is talked about in both the Swigert and the Deem article. So you might be familiar with SMART goals if you work in schools. Like, I know about SMART goals because I'm in a public school, and as part of our teacher evaluation process, we have to generate SMART goals for ourselves and for our students. It's like part of our evaluation process. If I would definitely recommend, if you either aren't familiar with SMART goals or you would just like to learn more about them, the Swigert and the Deem articles are really good and super helpful. If you can't access those because maybe you're not in a SIG, we do have some additional resources on SMART goals up on the website. So you can find a link to a helpful handout from the Massachusetts Teachers Association Center for Education Policy and Practice. This is not about writing SMART goals for clinicians. It really is about, it's tied to that teacher supervision and evaluation process. But what's nice about the handout is it does have a lot of different examples about how to apply that same framework to writing professional practice and student learning goals. Again, these are not the same thing as clinical goals, but if you're having trouble wrapping your head around like all of the components that need to go into a SMART goal, this handout has a lot of different examples. And while they're not clinical examples, it can help you kind of get a good feel for the structure of what SMART goals look like. We also have a link to an article by Irene Gilbert Torres from the September 2013 ASHA Leader Live titled Tricks to Take the Pain Out of Writing Treatment Goals. And that is not quite as in-depth as the two SIG articles, but it's a really nice overview as well. Okay. So we're going to synthesize information from those 4 sources. We're going to talk a little bit more about SMART goals.
I'm sitting here trying to guess what the acronym is for. I am.
What do you guess?
Well, I have the notes in front of me, so I feel like that's cheating. But
it's an open book.
It's an open book quiz, and I might fail. No, I don't think I would have guessed this. So the S stands for specific.
And that is good. And we'll talk more about that in a minute.
Okay.
Okay. We'll tell you all of them right now. Then we'll dig into each one. So okay. S, specific. You want them to be specific. M, measurable. A, depending on who you read, A could be actionable. A could be attainable. A could be achievable.
Interesting.
So there's a lot encompassed in the A. Similarly for R could mean relevant or realistic. And then T is timely. So we're going to break down all of those components. Yeah, don't worry. It's going to be good.
I hope all of our listeners are feeling a boost of confidence that the host is unfamiliar with her own content. To all of you out there, hopefully you feel good about yourselves. You should.
It's gonna be
making a fool of myself for all of you.
So specific. I mean, we know what this word means, right? Specific. That's a word that we've used in life, but
I get this one. This one makes sense to me.
It does, right? So Swigert, we're going to start with her. She links questions to each goal area, which I like a lot. Kate knows I love questions.
Amy loves to think in questions.
I love to think
very
in questions.
Analytic. This is why you are so good at your job.
I
just
not
like the way I think.
So this is maybe also how Swigert thinks. So
totally.
Yay, questions.
She's also a super nerd, I'm sure.
Perhaps, yes. So she says we have to know, to be specific, we have to know who is involved, what is getting accomplished, where this is happening, when, with which requirements and constraints, and why. So like, what is the reason that we're doing this goal?
That's the most important one to me. I have things to say about that, but I'll keep them in my thinking bubble.
No, say them out loud.
I can say them
we're literally on a podcast.
I didn't want to steal your thunder. Okay.
No.
Nothing makes me grouchier than seeing an objective that has no purpose. And it happens all the time. So I will read an objective. And for those of you listening, one of my biggest jobs is consulting and helping other speech pathologists, mentoring other speech pathologists and other special educators, behavior analysts, et cetera. So I read a lot of other people's objectives all the time. And one of the biggest things, first thing I say is, okay, this is a great goal. So why? Why are you working on this? What is this related to that is functional and important to the student or the client? And it's amazing how many times people, mom really wanted it he had a hard time this one day, or, there isn't a lot of thought behind the why. And the why is the most component of the S, or specific.
Well, and to connect it back sort of to the points that Swigert was making in terms of the medical environment, like that's directly connected to your patient or client outcomes too, right?
Yes.
If it's not something that's important and meaningful for the individual, then what's the point?
Well,
What's the point?
I really think a lot of times, in my experience, people choose objectives because it's what comes next. You know, they look at the developmental trajectory and it's like, oh well, this seems like it would come next, so that's what I'm going to pick, which makes sense. I mean, I can see that logic, but if you're not considering the underpinnings of why, yes, it comes next, but is there a way that you could tweak it to be impactful or related to something that is important to the student or family or client or other functional tasks in their environment? With if you don't consider that, then you're just arbitrarily, scooting them along some trajectory, which is not our jobs.
No, and I think another piece that connects with that is sometimes people write goals to fit different activities.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
which is in part what you're doing if you're in a school-based setting and you're connecting to curriculum, but you shouldn't be writing it for an activity that you've done or you have materials for. You should be writing it to connect back with that curriculum. So, in her article, Swigert gives an example because it's for dysphagia. That's the focus of the article. So, she gives examples of, a general goal versus a specific goal. So to look at an objective that you or I might support a team in writing, rather than saying the students' repair skills, ability to repair a communication breakdown will improve, right? So that's a broad idea.
Mhm.
But it doesn't answer those Swigert questions. It doesn't tell us who's involved. It tells us a little bit about what we want to accomplish. But it's pretty general. So like, how do you know when you've hit that
Mhm.
benchmark, right?
Mhm.
Doesn't tell us where it's happening, doesn't tell us when it's happening. I guess if it's an IEP, you sort of have a time frame because it's within that year time frame. It doesn't tell us the requirements and constraints, and it doesn't tell us why we're doing it, right?
Mhm.
So some ways that we could flesh that idea of repairing communication breakdowns will improve. How could we answer that? How could we answer some of her questions? I mean, who's involved? Maybe when speaking with a less familiar listener in the main office, the student will increase their ability to repair a communication breakdown when the listener tells them, I don't understand, can you say it again? In order to become more independent with communicating with people who are less familiar listeners. That's just an example of the level of detail that you kind of need to put in there to answer those different questions. And that also comes into like when you write that objective, you're like, oh golly, that feels
Oh
awfully
golly.
long, right? Like,
Oh
oh
my
golly,
gosh, my golly. That's what I think of when you say
that objective feels too long, like.
ah. Yes. It feels too long.
but
It's
but
okay.
like get comfortable with it, right? Because ultimately you want a long objective because it needs to be long in order to answer all those questions. So back to specificity, the S of the SMART goal. Deem includes some other important considerations in hers. Again, she's the person who's writing the article specific to the school environment. She says, be specific but jargon free. And I think this is a really helpful point when we talk about, writing goals and objectives that are functional in a school environment. You really want everybody on the team to understand your goals so that hopefully you're all working collaboratively to
Yes.
make them happen. If you're using super speechy terms, the general educator is probably not really going to understand what you're saying and may or may not have the time to reach out to you to clarify, right? So if you can make it as user-friendly as possible, most parents and guardians aren't speech pathologists. Make it de-jargon it so that
Mhm.
it's friendly to people who aren't speech pathologists. Um, she also talks about prompts. So I see this a lot. I don't know if you see this a lot, Kate, but
Mhm.
sometimes we'll write goals and objectives that use generic statements like moderate verbal prompting.
Well, what does that mean?
Exactly. What does that mean?
I don't know what that means. I
So
mean, that could
in
be
the
a million different things depending on who's doing the prompting, what their history is with the student or client, you know, what the student's needs are, what are their sensory needs, what are their frustration tolerances. Moderate prompting could mean 1,000 different things.
Yeah. Yeah. So Deem's solution to that is, if you're talking about prompts, which she says you should, if you're including that as a condition of your goal, make sure you use specific examples. So our objective that we just said earlier, which I've already forgotten, about repairs, we would be more specific. So if we were saying, the student's going to repair in the office, when the person says, I don't understand, can you say it again? And we wanted to say, with moderate verbal prompting, we're going to include in parentheses an example, such
Okay.
as, you need to tell Mrs. Baxter what you want for lunch, right? Maybe that's maximal. I don't really know. But give some examples
But
about
it's a
what.
spectrum. I think that's the point. I mean,
Mhm.
that could be for a kid who can't tolerate you giving prompts at all. One sentence of a verbal prompt could be a maximum. That's a maximum amount of prompting that kid can handle. I mean, it could mean so many different things.
So if you're using phrases like, I think a big takeaway for me is, if you're using phrases like minimal, maximal, moderate, cues, prompts, just do a little example in there so that people reading it have a picture in their mind about what that looks like for you and what you're thinking about as the person writing the goal. Um,
One of the things that I've done in the past, which maybe I always get nervous when I tell examples because I'm afraid that you're going to be like, no, that's a terrible idea. But I have imposter syndrome in my own podcast. How pathetic is that? Um, but I try to put quantifiers around it. So use an example, but maybe say no more than one verbal cue that contains one sentence or something.
yeah. Yeah. I mean,
So it could be any
basically,
sentence, but this is exactly or sometimes I'll do it with gesture cue, no more than one specific gesture cue, and then have that example.
I think that would be meeting what Deem is suggesting that we do, right? So just spelling it out so that the person reading the objective has a better idea of what you're talking about. Um, a couple of other points that she puts in here, make sure that your target behavior is actionable and observable. So again, it's really hard or impossible to know if somebody has learned or understood something. So you may use some actual examples. Again, uh, don't smush too many things into one goal. I think this
Smush.
happens a lot too,
Oh,
the
yes.
smooshing, right? So you might want, she gives a great example in the article just about, answering questions after reading a passage, and like all these different skills that actually go into that. Um, in general, you don't want to smush too many skills in there, because what happens is you're not getting good data. Back to the data. You're not getting good data when you're trying to collect data on a million different things. And how are you going to know, like, parts of the goal will be achieved, but the whole goal won't be achieved? So
Right. And
if
then
you're
where do you know where the communication breakdown, not communication breakdown, where do you know where the breakdown is? So if they only achieved part of the objective, but you only have data on the whole objective, then where do you know where the learning, where you need to, where you need to put supports?
Yep. So specificity is important. You can make sure that you're being specific if you answer questions like, who is involved, what's accomplished, where is it happening, when, with which requirements and constraints, and why. Um, get rid of the jargon. If you're talking about prompting, give specific examples. That's your S. How about the M? Measurable.
Oh, I was gonna guess. I was gonna do another guess.
You were going to guess what the M was?
That's okay. Never mind. Moving on. Timestamp.
So for measurable, Swigert also gives us more questions. Love this article. When we're constructing a measurable goal and objective, we're answering questions like how much, how many, and how will I know when it's been accomplished? Deem says measurable goals have 4 key components. They involve an observable behavior, the level of support or prompting needed, criteria, and the conditions under which the skill will occur. So we need to be specific about all of these different things.
I think one of the things I see missing a lot is the conditions under which the skill will occur. Like most of us learn in
Mhm.
graduate school that it has to be observable, it has to be measurable. You put a number, you have to be able to measure it somehow. But saying the conditions under which the skill will occur is a massive component to measuring success or failure. So if you've taught one specific skill, but they do it in the wrong context, then what kind of skill have you just given that student or client?
Well, and I think, Dee makes some really good points in her article where this is this is a unique consideration, I think, for the school environment, or it's just maybe more impactful in the school environment because school encompasses so many environments, little sub environments. And the actual goal, connecting it back to our institutional, drivers, the actual goal is for the student to access their academics, right? So she makes the point that if somebody's able to do something in an isolated one-on-one quiet environment in a therapy room with a skilled communication partner who's able to scaffold and fade and bring back in prompting and different supports, that doesn't necessarily mean anything about their ability to do that same skill in a busy classroom, right? So one of her suggestions was consider adding an additional aspect to the goal, like a generalization criteria. So that way you're looking at that skill being applied in different types of environments with different types of people. And I think that this sometimes leads to some confusion between outpatient and school-based providers, having been in both of those roles.
I was just about to say that. I mean, when you mentioned this about, I just think about my sterile white room that I used to treat in.
Yeah.
Okay, great. You had the best session in the world. What does that mean? That means you had the best session in the world in a sterile white room. Does that mean anything to, his or her ability to use that skill in the parking lot, in the waiting room, in the class, in the busy classroom, in the home environment? And I think that's particularly true for our more complex learners, or learners who have, a more emergent profile or have particular difficulty with generalization. Um, Considering those factors, or I guess you could, looking at it the opposite, not considering those factors is really a failure and a waste.
Well, and I think even for students who are accessing more of their instruction in general education, they may have kind of a past experience as a learner. We talked about this a little bit, I think, in our behavior talk that we did with that inclusive strategies book. But you may have a student who can answer the question, but has had such an experience of being incorrect in that general education environment that they have maybe anxiety around doing that. So there
Mhm.
can be variables
Good
around
point. Yep.
learning the content, but there can also be other variables that make generalization challenging. Or maybe, in your speech and language therapy session, you are using certain scaffolds or visual supports that maybe aren't happening in general education. So that generalization piece, I think, is really important.
Mhm.
Um, when we are thinking about the components connected to measurability, I think that having all of that in mind and connecting it back to the specificity and the purpose for the goal is also very important. And you want to enlist as many supporters as you can. So if you're in a medical model, that means making sure, that you are doing those collaborative goal setting conversations and getting commitment from parents and caregivers. If you're in the school environment, you want to make sure you're collaborating with your other team members and just making sure that you're capturing all those pieces. Okay, so specific, measurable. Now
And
we're
then
getting into the ones that have like lots of things.
of
Attainable,
all
also
the three,
actionable.
yeah, of all the three A's that you said, I think attainable or achievable are my favorite.
Yeah.
Because this one, it really, I'm going to say it, it chafes my ass.
Attainability?
Yeah. When no,
Tell me more.
no, when I see an objective that is written that is not achievable,
Oh yeah.
it
Yeah. Well, I think
it drives me crazy. That's all I'll
so
say.
this is where the collaboration piece can be hard, right? Because when you're writing collaborative objectives with other people, you do, as the speech language pathologist on the team, you have different knowledge and skills around this, but you are one of many voices at the table. So I think sometimes those unachievable goals come out of a conversation of which the SLP is one part of a broader whole. But I agree. I think if your goal isn't achievable, then the other parts don't really matter, right? And when we think about our code of ethics, we're really supposed to be providing services only where a benefit can be reasonably expected.
Mm-hmm.
So if it's not reasonable, you need to go back to the drawing board. And sometimes that's hard depending on your funding source, right? You may have a learner who takes an extended period of time to acquire a skill. The skill is appropriate, it's meaningful, it's functional. You have been specific about all the different components related to it, but the reality is you're on a 60-day recertification schedule and the person is not able to achieve that goal within 60 days. Does that mean it's not a reasonable goal for them? No. But I think as the clinician, it means you have to be really thoughtful about different ways that you can write your objective so that you are moving toward and achieving kind of sub-objectives within your specified time frame. So I think that's where the prompting can come into play. That might be where you talk about, you know what, the individual who's coming for outpatient is working on the skill. It's really important. We are all on board. These are the steps to get there, but we're recerting every 60 days. So maybe you think a lot about being very specific about the prompting that you describe and the scaffolds and supports in your environment.
While
And you're
also
writing
maintaining some semblance of a plan to fade those prompts, because
exactly.
I see the same problem with persistent writing of goals and objectives that have so much prompting in them because they want the student to have the skill or they want the client to have the skill because they want it. But the plan for fading those prompts for independence is maybe the piece of it that's unreasonable or not reasonably achievable. And I think I mean, it's such an individual decision, but it's very, very important. It's a really just to me, it's an ethical issue for
I
sure.
think it I think it is an ethical issue.
I think you just confirmed it was an ethical issue because we read our code of ethics. It's
Thingy.
fine.
But I agree with you.
I'm
I think,
winning today.
this you're totally winning.
I'm winning. It's fine.
This is where you step back and also look at the assessment piece, right? So you're setting your goals based on the information that you have around your assessment and around best practice. So if you feel like you have a goal, you wrote the goal, you get to the end of your recertification period, your client hasn't met the goal, that's also could be a clue to you to go back to the research and see if you could be working on it in a different way. I agree with you. If you're using a lot of different prompts and environmental supports, thinking about what your plan is for fading those or increasing the person's independence if it's going to be a long-term accommodation, right? Some systematic supports could just be accommodations that are something the person is going to need long-term, but helping to make them more independent around those. So yes, we want it to be actionable. We want it to be achievable and attainable. Depending on your work environment, something else just to know about would be the ASHA NOMs and the FCM measures. So that might be helpful for you. This was mentioned in the Swigert model. These are connected mostly to healthcare settings, also to EI. And these are scoring and coding methods and a database that if you're a member of the database, you can get access to that. Could be a time to share some information with others, loop back and think about your patient-reported outcomes, involving the clients and their families in the planning and the commitment to follow through and practice outside the session. That's also going to affect your achievability. If you as the clinician have a conversation where people say, yes, we'll do our homework every week, and then the only time the person is actually working on the skill is like 30 minutes, twice a week with you, that potentially attainable goal is no longer attainable because people aren't doing their practice. Just last time, to kill my PT analogy, like if I didn't do my exercises at home, going and doing it, for one session a week is not going to fix my knee, right? So I had to make the commitment to do that.
And just to hammer it home again, this all comes down to your data. If your data does not reflect that the student or client or per individual, whatever, is making progress, then you are ethically required to reevaluate your treatment and your objectives.
1,000%. And you don't have to wait. That's right. 1,000%. You don't have to wait if you are if you're on an annual cycle, you don't have to wait until the end when you reconvene the IEP team to amend your goals. You can amend your goals at any time.
Right.
You just need to have a conversation as a group, talk about what's going on. If something isn't working and you think it needs to be revised, you should be asking yourself those questions all of the time. So you've got specificity. You're saying, what you're doing. It's really specific. It's measurable. It's attainable. The R, it's relevant.
Relevant
/
or
realistic.
Realistic. I like that one more than relevant. But I guess I like them both.
I mean, I think that they both words are worth thinking about as you're crafting your goals, right? So when we think about Sweigert's article, she says a realistic goal is not only attainable, but it's something that the patient agrees they're willing to work toward, right?
Or something that is realistic within their functional everyday life, or realistic to achieve within your setting with the resources that you have. I mean, I think that can touch on a lot of different components.
Well, and I think, she makes the point that clients and caregivers will be more committed to work on the goal if it's something that's important to them. I think about this as somebody who works in AAC and in school-based settings, involving that greater team, making sure you're involving the student, making sure the student, there's a reason we have students involved in their transition planning, talking about what their goals and objectives are with the student. These are your goals and objectives. This is why we're working on these things. What do you think about this? What is your input? From Deem, she says for schools, this is potentially one of the easiest areas of a SMART goal, because as long as you're connecting it with the curriculum, then it's always going to be relevant, because schools are driven by access to the curriculum, which I think was a very good point as well. And then I guess we're on to the last one, which is timely.
I don't get this one.
So you need a time frame. So this is sort of just thinking about what are your parameters for achieving this goal. And I feel like these are mostly set institutionally, right? So we've talked a lot about when you're in healthcare, you're recertifying that's a different timeline depending on your funding source, right? But each funding source has a timeline.
Now I see.
School, right? Like you're connected.
Now
with it.
I get it.
Like we're going to do this someday.
Right.
Someday.
Yes.
I think one other piece that connects with this is, the difference between long-term and short-term goals. The Zweigert article has a really nice table where she breaks down short-term versus long-term. And then she has this further distinction between short-term and treatment objectives, with short-term goals being like what you're working on and why, and treatment objectives being how. Across all of the places where I've worked, I've never done that. I've always had it integrated.
I haven't either.
Yeah. So, and she has both. She has the example of like those two things separated out and also integrated together to be the short-term objective. So you can get a feel for both of them. But I thought that was a really nice piece about that example.
I know how to write a SMART goal.
Right? You know how to write a SMART goal. So when we're writing a SMART goal, it's going to be specific, including able to answer questions like who is involved, what is getting accomplished, where is it happening, when, with which requirements and constraints, and why. If you're going to talk about prompting, you're going to be specific, de-jargon it, you're going to give examples, it's going to be measurable, and you're going to think hard about data and different ways to collect data.
I see you have a note here about goal banks. What is that?
So goal banks are something that some schools have. I don't have access to one, so I don't know what it is. But essentially, it's like a place where you can go in and look for goals, right? What's a good goal for that? Like, I remember when I first started out, I worked in an outpatient clinic, and we had like electronic records, right? And you could like look. Did we even have electronic records? I actually don't remember. Perhaps I was looking just in files.
Back in the old days.
But I remember back in the old days, I remember like reading through my CF supervisor, like all of these different like goals and objectives to try and like get better at goals, right? Like I wanted to get better at goals. So goal banks are basically that where you just, there's a ton of goals and you can pick a goal.
Interesting.
And like plug it in for your student.
Is that a good idea?
No, but potentially a little bit, right? I think it's a good idea in the sense of if you're somebody who's especially newer to the field or newer to an area of the field, I think it can be a very helpful learning experience to look and see what types of goals other people have written for people with a similar profile. I don't see how that is really different from reading any other information to help you be a better clinician. It can be very helpful to be like, oh, I never thought about wording it that way. I remember in just like doing file reviews when I was like brand new, just trying to be like, oh, I never thought about writing it like that. I never thought about doing a frequency count. Never thought about that. Right. So in seeing all of those things, I think it can be a really helpful educational experience for you as the clinician. I think the problem arises when that's where you're getting your goals, right? So if you're going to a goal bank to get ideas and to learn, I personally don't see the problem in that. I don't see how that's
And maybe
bad.
this is a great opportunity to discuss it with other stakeholders or a mentor if you have one. Is this a good objective that I just pulled from the bank? I want to use it for X, Y, and Z. Can you customize it? All those kinds of things.
Right. I think goal banks are a learning place. This is just like my perception, but
That makes
that they
sense.
would be a learning place. It's not where you should be writing your goals, especially, I mean, if you're working in a school, you're literally writing goals for an individualized education plan. Individualized is legit the first word in IEP.
There you go.
Right.
It's right there in front of, it's been right there under your nose the whole time.
Correct. So, you really want to make sure that you are following the SMART guidelines. And if you're following the SMART guidelines, it's connected to something that's meaningful for the person and all of these other things. And it's unlikely that some generic bank checks all those boxes for your person, right? The generic bank didn't do an assessment. The generic bank didn't talk to the team. Like the generic bank didn't do any of these things. But the generic bank could help like stimulate ideas for you as a clinician.
Right. We've covered a lot of ground today.
Yeah.
I'm very impressed. I feel like I learned quite a bit.
I feel like we can spend an hour talking about writing goals and objectives.
You can. We were planning for this. I was like, God, we really think we could spend a whole hour? We could fill up a whole hour of time talking about just one sentence? But turns out, not only is that true, but we had to tailor it down and set timers because there was just so much to say. We've reviewed the code of ethics, the ethical components of goal and objective writing, the assessment component, data, different kinds of data, how data collection is a cornerstone of goal and objective writing, the importance of getting stakeholder input, considering different components of your work setting, and SMART objectives: specific, measurable, actionable / attainable / achievable, relevant / realistic, and timely. That was a lot of mouthfuls.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's a lot of mouthfuls.
It's a lot.
Well, we hope you enjoyed this topic. Amy, is there anything else that you want to say about this topic?
No, I think that goal writing is a skill, and it's something that you learn how to do over time. But if you keep the SMART goal framework in your mind and use that as a guidepost, it really will help you get better at including all of those components without writing a goal that's so specific you feel like you've painted yourself into a corner, right? I would definitely recommend both the Swigert and the Deem article. They do a great job. There's examples in both of those, examples of goals and examples of goals that are a bit broad that they, walk you through making them more specific. I would definitely recommend that you check those out. But measurable goals, exciting and doable.
Good times. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. We hope you enjoyed it. Even if you didn't, you can leave us a review or a rating wherever you get your podcasts. As a reminder, there is a handout available that it's an outline that is the content of today's episode with all of our resources available for $1. If you would like to have a permanent product with all of this great information, there are certificates of attendance available on our website as well. You just purchase the certificate and you'll get an automated email to take the quiz, and then the certificate will be automatically sent to you. And references and articles and online resources are all available for free related to this topic on the episode page. Visit us at www.slpnerdcast.com for all that information, and we will see you around next time.
Excellent.